dodge this.
I want to carry on into the conversation of Justice Scalia, because I know I only got you for a short more period of time. So, when Scalia died, a couple months back, when Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died, we had a conversation via text about the entire situation. And, to quote Hamlet, something's rotten in the town of Denmark. And I just felt right away that the information that had come out about the situation was very shady. And you seem to have the same opinion of the situation, but you had a much better understanding and knowledge because you're there in Texas. So, with that in mind, feel free to expand on your thoughts about the death of Justice Scalia, and if you think he was taken out, and if he was, why?
Whew. Okay. In the state of Texas, when any death occurs, any death, crackhead, police officer, city councilman, mayor, governor, Supreme Court justice, nobody is supposed to touch that body until it's released by a medical examiner. And generally speaking, the medical examiner, especially in rural counties, makes the scene to make sure that everything jives. And then they release the body, and the body can be transported to, a funeral home and go on about their business, and they'll sign the death certificate. My issues with Scalia are he was found in his bedroom. Some reports had a pillow over his head. Some reports just said his head was obscured. From what I understand, the medical examiner, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head, she phoned in and talked to somebody on the phone and released the body over the phone. Never having seen the situation, been able to look at the evidence, talk to the witnesses, nothing. His body was then transported, and I believe he was cremated a short time later. Problem. Nobody on the outside ever saw that body. Nobody knew the situation surrounding his death. Nobody from the outside interviewed witnesses. The medical examiner didn't do her job. And that would have been for anybody. We're not talking Supreme Court justice. In this situation, the only acceptable path would have been when they find the body, they should have immediately secured the scene and contacted the Texas Rangers because it was a rural area. The Texas Rangers would have come down and conducted an investigation, interviewed witnesses, taken photographs, measurements. Then and only then would the medical examiner come in, do their own separate investigation, release the body, and the body would have been released for processing. I have serious problems. In fact, this kind of, in ways, to me, harkens back to the fiasco with JFK's body after he died at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. There was a well-known altercation between Texas law enforcement and Secret Service, where Texas law enforcement told the Secret Service, this body's not going anywhere, because he died in the state of Texas, and we have laws that govern how that body should be handled. The Secret Service threatened an armed confrontation to force them to release his body without a medical inquest. So with Scalia, you have potentially a spoiled scene. You have a medical examiner who released the body without ever viewing the situation, viewing the evidence, or viewing the body. And you have the fact that it's a Supreme Court justice. I don't know whether he was murdered or not. Nobody will ever know. When you look at what's going on today, could he have been murdered? Absolutely, he could have been murdered. But we'll never know. But what I can say is, without a doubt, the handling of that dead body, that dead man scene, was handled incorrectly from beginning to end. And because of the intentional or accidental malfeasance on the part of law enforcement and the medical examiner, or county judge or constable, whoever, not constable, but the local magistrate, however they mishandled it. We will never know the truth of it. But I find it odd. The timing is very odd. And the situation would have dictated a full investigation, even if they were 100% sure that he died of a heart attack or whatever in his sleep. The situation dictated a full investigation, and it didn't happen. And so it's reasonable to say, was it bungled on accident or was it bungled on purpose? And we'll just never know. And I wish there would have been more thorough, even more than we had, investigation, because honestly, it was such a shoddy investigation. We can't even dream up conspiracy theories on it because the investigation was so bad. At least with other conspiracies, normally we have some facts to go on. But this one was handled so terribly from beginning to end, the facts will never be known. And Scalia could have very well been murdered in that room, and it was covered up. But we'll never know. What do you think, Popeye?
Well, there's a lot of shady things with his death. I mean, they said that they found him with a pillow over his head, and then a couple days later, the guy was like, "No, let me clarify. I mean, it was above his head on the bed." Really? Really? You said it was over his head. You didn't say above. You didn't say sitting on the bed above it. You said over his head. The whole autopsy thing, just the way the whole body was handled, the way that the coroner did it over the phone, like not even in person, relying solely on what the officers at the scene and the whatever agents were at the scene, whatever information that they were able to get from them. That doesn't sound, I mean, I know it can be done, but it just doesn't sound right in the case of a Supreme Court justice. And there's also the possibility that the bungling of the investigation itself was done on purpose to hide the evidence. Like you said, it was done so bad that there's not even evidence for people to debate over. Doesn't that sound odd? Just saying. It sounds a little odd for an investigation, especially of this depth. So perhaps the entire bungling of the situation was done on purpose, so that facts will never be found. There can't be any conspiracy theories or questions because it's never going to be found.
Let me also say that the government structure in South Texas is notoriously corrupt. Notorious. Pretty much every election cycle, you have election irregularities that lead to, investigations, and sometimes people being fired or thrown in prison. I mean, just look it up. Google search it. South Texas corruption. And you'll have probably thousands of hits because their governments are corrupt. And if you want to, for argument's sake, take somebody out, where better to do it than where the government is corrupt and people can be paid off and look the other way. It was the perfect setting. It was rural. It was private and rural. And it wouldn't be a large or irreasonable leap to say that somebody was paid off to look the other way and to make sure that it wasn't handled right. I mean, my understanding was he didn't even have a full autopsy. Standard in Texas is, unless you're actively under the care of your doctor for what could be considered a life-threatening illness, a full autopsy always takes place. But in Scalia's situation, his family said they didn't want a full autopsy for whatever reason, and they said okay. Had the investigation been handled correctly from the beginning, it wouldn't be a red flag that a full autopsy wasn't done. But the fact it was bungled from the very beginning, to add that cherry on top, that we're not even going to do a full autopsy on Scalia, is absolutely insane. We don't know if he was drugged. We don't know if he died of asphyxia. We don't know if there were petechia in his retinas, which would show that he was smothered. We don't know because it was bungled from the very beginning, and then nobody dared put a stop to it somewhere in the middle and say, wait a second, this is a sitting Supreme Court justice. There is some decorum. There is some procedure that needs to be followed for anyone's death, but more especially someone in a powerful position as a Supreme Court justice.
Well, again, something's rotten in the town of Denmark. I expect at the very least that because it was a Supreme Court justice, and I know the family can say, no, we don't want one, but as an investigator myself, right, I was a private investigator, you know this. So let's say I was a federal investigator, right, or local law enforcement official, and I was called to the scene, and I get there, and obviously he was a Supreme Court justice, so the U.S. Marshals are going to be there. So they're going to show up eventually. They're supposed to have protection, even if he didn't want protection. There's going to be one, I would assume relatively close to him, or within a half hour to an hour of where he is. I just can't see the U.S. Marshals, saying, okay, sir, and then going back to their office and not actually guarding the guy, even though, you know what I mean? Like just saying, yes, sir, we'll leave you alone, and then guarding him from a distance if they had to. It's still their job. And anyway, I digress. So if I'm a U.S. Marshal, if I'm going to look at this, and I stumble upon this Supreme Court justice who has died, I'm not going to just say, natural causes, because you really can't tell what he died of unless you have an autopsy. So they have the ability to be like, okay, we need to investigate this properly. He needs to have an autopsy done. Then the family would have to go to the lead investigator and say, does there really need to be an autopsy done? Like, they'd have to go out of their way to try to get it stopped. Whereas it was set up so it was more so the family's decision, and they're like, no, we don't want one, which in itself is weird. Now, I understand that the grieving process. Trust me, I'm not picking on anybody for how they grieve. I've done shows about that. Okay, I know very, very, very intimately about that. But if my loved one died in a rural area at some secret society get-together, which that's what it was, some little conservative secret society get-together, whatever the reason they're out there for, it's this little secretive group. He's out there at this get-together in a secluded area. He's a Supreme Court justice who's been known to be a defender of things like the Second Amendment and other freedoms. And I'm not saying he's, oh my God, here comes the hero, Scalia. But I'm saying he's known to have this stance, and then suddenly he dies a mysterious death, and the circumstances are mysterious, and like every standard operating procedure was violated. One after another, after another, after another, but violated it blatantly, but in a way that you could tell it's a well-greased corruption machine. Like, they've handled other things like this before. That this wasn't their first rodeo, the way this whole thing was handled. And I just thought it was really shady that a Supreme Court justice, there was just like, oh, he died, end of story, bye. And nobody was like, wow, that's kind of weird, though, the whole way he died. I mean, if that were anybody else, there would have been a much deeper investigation. So I thought it was odd that because it was a Supreme Court justice that it wasn't done. I mean, that alone to me was probably the biggest red flag. And then the family's reaction. And people could say, well, the family, Popeye. Yeah, they could easily have gotten to the family and said, by the way, we did this to him. Or make a comment implying that they did something to him, and then implying that if you don't do what you're told, or you don't listen, or you just, in this case, don't ask for an autopsy. If you ask for the autopsy and you push it, I'd hate to see something bad happen to, like your grandkids or your daughter, or your son, or whatever. If I don't remember if he had kids or not, but if they had kids, then that's how they do it. Or maybe she has a sister who has kids, and they've got pictures of those kids on their way to school. That's the way. I mean, if they're going to kill a Supreme Court justice, these people, that's the level they do things. They don't just like half-ass things. They cover every aspect. That's really the unfortunate level of that kind of thing that happens. So, that being said, those were my big red flags. And to me, seeing just the way the whole thing was handled was like, what? if this were anybody else, they would have done a better job than that. I'm just kind of surprised that they didn't, being that he was a Supreme Court justice, that it wasn't gone beyond. You know what I mean? Like, you would expect that they would follow every rule, dot every I, cross every T, and it was just like, the whole way through. And like you said, it kind of brings up a lot of things from the Kennedy assassination that have to deal with corruption, and the way that there was a lot of corruption surrounding not only the assassination of the president himself, but the deaths of other people, like witnesses and stuff too. And it goes to show you that level of like boss hog corruption is still there to this very day in 2016.
Yes, it is. And I want to be real clear about something. It was not the family's call initially. That justice of the peace would have had to have waived jurisdiction on the autopsy before the family would have even gotten a choice. So the first level was the justice of the peace saying, I'm going to phone this one in, and then saying, given the testimony that was widely reported, I'm not going to order an autopsy. And then it falls to the family to decide. So it was bungled from beginning to end. It was allowed to be a incompetent investigation from the top to the bottom. And the ball was dropped at the local level, the state level, the county level, the federal level. It was dropped all the way. And that would have been for anybody. But for a sitting Supreme Court justice who was a controversial Supreme Court justice, there's no looking the other way. Something was wrong. And I'm not one to believe in coincidences. So this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. And we'll never know. But yeah, this is in some ways worse than the Kennedy. The body handling was somewhat worse than the Kennedy assassination situation, because they had the Kennedy assassination. It was pandemonium. It was shock. It was horror. It was national disaster, national tragedy. This was a guy dying at a secluded private club in the middle of nowhere, South Texas. There was no hurry to do anything. There was no reason to get in a hurry. And yet it was handled in a very hurried fashion and bungled completely. And he could have been murdered. Someone may have gotten away with murder of a Supreme Court justice. We'll never know. And just further weakens whatever faith somebody somewhere may have in the system. It just further weakens that whatever faith they may have. If they can murder a Supreme Court justice, they can murder anybody.
Yeah, well, they blew the president's head off in Dealey Plaza 50 years ago and didn't get in trouble for it, so...
Yep.
There's that. But yeah, there's a lot of shadiness that went on with that case, so I wanted to get your take on it, and I know you had said that there was a lot of boss hog corruption there in Texas, a lot of good old boy type stuff behind the scenes, and I could see that you'd have him taken out at a spot that was secluded, and you'd have him taken out
a spot that's controlled.
Yeah, in an area that is controlled heavily by the locals who are in your pocket. It's the same way they killed Kennedy. It's the exact same way they killed Jack. They did him in Dallas because they knew Lyndon had Texas, and Lyndon controlled a lot of the things down there and had a lot of sway at the time, so they could get away with a lot of things.
And Alan Dulles was...
Dulles too. Well, he got fired. He gets fired by Kennedy over the whole Bay of Pigs invasion, and then he's put in charge of the investigation. Cabell was the mayor of Dallas, and his brother was working with the CIA in the Bay of Pigs, and he was in the military. He was a general. He got fired, and he was quite pissed off. And then his brother just happens to be the mayor of Dallas, and the parade route was changed at the last minute with the Secret Service and the mayor's office. So that would mean you needed to have the mayor of Dallas in on it and the head of the Secret Service. Oh, well, that's doable. I mean, there were a lot of people that were in on it. But anyway, I digress. So there's that boss hog, type scumbaggery. You have the mayor of Dallas, whose brother was fired by Kennedy, pissed off. Good old boy makes sure he's got the right people in place. Not that they did the assassination, but he would at least have the right people in place to help facilitate whatever was needed. And that's how it's done.
Well, and then you put your wild conspiracy cap on, and he was there with some religious secret society meeting at this private club, and there's been questions surrounding who paid for the private jet that took him down there, and he declined federal protection on this trip, and it's just you all roll it together, and it just stinks. It stinks horribly. And
I wonder how they
die.
I wonder how they convinced him to get him over there with no protection. Like, he had to have been smart enough to realize that he was under some sort of threat. So, I wonder how long they planned it. I mean, they had to lure him in there and keep him comfortable in order for him to, because they said he turned away his own security detail. Like, he was like, "Nah, I don't want protection." That's why I said before, you'd think that a U.S. Marshal would still even protect at a distance, so to speak. Protect them without them knowing.
And you wrap it all up, and yet there's no investigation. And that's essentially what happened. There was no investigation of this death of a Supreme Court justice under suspicious circumstances. No investigation. No detail to protect him in a secluded area. Dies suspiciously. No investigation. Body doesn't have an autopsy. Can you write a cheesy, conspiracy novel on a more crappy plot? It wouldn't sell any books because it's a crappy plot. But in this situation, it's what really happened, and we'll never know.
Well, all I'm gonna say is it's extremely shady that it went down the way it went down. It's extremely, extremely shady that he died the way he died. Like you said, out in the middle of nowhere. No investigation. You would think that they would want to investigate the death of a Supreme Court justice, but, John, stop being a conspiracy theorist. In fact, the way you speak, detective, is almost like you were a homicide detective or something, and you're trying to come from a place of logic, like you're actually, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. John's not, you can try to use that pejorative label, he's a conspiracy theorist. Actually, no, he's a seasoned homicide detective. Hello, we're talking about the murder, or, excuse me, the supposed murder, but the death of a Supreme Court justice. And yet, you have a retired, seasoned homicide detective telling you, yeah, something doesn't smell right. They should have done at least the most basic of investigations, and they didn't. It was like, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Send him off, let him be buried, make the family happy. He served with dignity. We need to treat him with dignity. I'm pretty sure that if he died under suspicious circumstances, he would want his death investigated. He was, after all, a Supreme Court justice, and wasn't he working for the law? And isn't the law to have his death investigated? I'm just, it's this cycle I see of bullshit. Anyway, yeah, I honestly don't buy any of it. I think the whole thing stinks to high hell. And to know that a seasoned homicide detective is going, can I raise my hand here for a second and point out a few problems with this whole thing? It makes me feel good to know that my bullshit detector is not broken, and that the meter going, pinning itself when I heard that the official version of events in regards to Scalia's death. I'm glad that the detector is still working, because I saw that and I was like, wait, what? What? No. So good to know that I'm not the only one, especially, like I said, a seasoned investigator such as yourself, John. You've done real investigations of deaths before and crimes and stuff, so I don't, you know what to look for better than anyone, because you actually have done this. That was your profession, and you're saying that this, you're hoisting the flag that screams, "Wait a minute, there's a problem here." So you're hoisting the BS flag on this. Just saying, to the average listener who might think that, oh, Scalia just died and his family, whatever, blah, 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 there's no conspiracy. Remember, conspiracy, the definition, is actually a legal charge, and it's two or more people getting together to do something bad, i.e. a plot. So if you had two or more people conspiring, which you would need to, conspiring to take out a Supreme Court justice, and then covering it up. See, you could always tell, you don't want to believe the initial act was a murder, that's fine. Break it down into two parts. I say this all the time. It's 9/11, the JFK assassination, anything. If you don't want to believe the crime was perpetrated on purpose, or a murder, or a false flag terror event in the case of 9/11, break it down into two pieces: the event and the aftermath of the event. And in the aftermath, you always have to look at the investigation. And when you look at the investigation, and it's whitewashed and covered up, and people lie and people die, well, just saying, right?
You hit the nail on the head.
Just saying. It's like you break it into two pieces, and you look at the way that they respond to it, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, what? This response is absurd. This doesn't make any sense. And when you start to use a little bit of logic, you start to look at things like that. You start to notice things like that. Anyway,
nor will it ever make any sense.
No, I don't think the world... Right now, dude, the world is so topsy-turvy, it's crazy.
Reminds me of a famous Chinese curse, and remember the word curse. May you live in interesting times.
Yeah, well...
And we live in interesting times.
It's
a curse.
That we do, my friend. We do certainly live in interesting times. But I'm glad that I'm here in the middle of the maelstrom to at least do something about it.